Okay, so, embalming, not exactly a light lunch conversation, but thanks to the material you found from RoleCatcher, we're going to really get into it. What it is, what it takes, the whole 9 yards.
And you know what's really interesting? It's how much this deep dive shows you about the human side of like death and all
Yeah.
that. It's not just, the technical stuff. This guide really goes on about care and respect, working with the families to make sure they get what they want.
So it's like bridging this gap
Right.
between the I guess, clinical part of death and what the people who are grieving need. That's got to take a certain kind of person.
Yeah, for sure. The guide even mentions stuff like social perceptiveness and being a good listener as like important skills. You're guiding people through this rough time. Gotta have empathy.
Makes you think about those interactions in a whole new way, not just preparing the deceased or whatever, but the people they leave behind, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you need a real mix of knowledge for it. The chemistry of the embalming, sure, but also like how people grieve, different cultures, the whole thing.
Okay, so you need the skills, the empathy, and then there's the job itself. The guide mentions hazardous chemicals and crazy hours.
Right. Not your average 9 to 5, that's for sure. You gotta have a strong stomach, be okay with some tough situations. Imagine using makeup to fix someone's face after, well, something awful. Artistry and compassion all in one.
Yeah, wow, most people don't even think about that. But it makes sense. You're helping the family, too, not just.
It's true. Very powerful. And it shows the level of like professionalism and ethics this job needs.
The guide also mentioned moving up in the career, which I'm curious about. How do you go from starting out to, say, lead embalmer?
It's actually pretty structured. You might start by helping out the senior embalmers, learning as you go, then maybe handling removals on your own as a junior embalmer.
Like an apprenticeship, then. Not all books and stuff, but actually doing it?
Exactly. The more you do it, the better you get, you move up. The guide says senior embalmers run the whole embalming process. They train the new folks and do the really intricate stuff we talked about, the cosmetic work. They're like the masters, passing it down.
So not just knowing how to do it, but making sure everyone else does too.
Yeah.
And keeping those ethical standards high.
Right on. And if you want to be in charge, there's light embalmer, managing maybe a bunch of funeral homes, making sure everything's done the same way, maybe even like making the rules for how it's done.
Wow, it's like a whole other world with
Yeah.
its own ladder to climb, special skills, even groups for embalmers only.
It really is. And speaking of special skills, there's this one, restorative art.
Restorative art. That sounds, I don't know, really detailed. What is that exactly?
It's like it sounds you're using these special techniques to basically rebuild parts of the face. Sometimes after, something really bad happened, you need to be good with your hands, obviously, but also know like anatomy and stuff. Real artistry.
Wow. It's kind of amazing to think about. Getting that level of detail right. You're giving the family a sense of peace. Like they can recognize them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a whole skill set on its own within the field. And speaking of specialized, the guide also says you got to understand all the different cultures and religions, how they view death, I mean.
Right. Of course, funeral homes, they work with everyone.
For sure. Like some cultures, they have these rituals for washing and dressing the body. Others need a burial super fast, certain times. Embalmers have to know all that, be sensitive, to really be compassionate.
She's how human this whole thing is, even though. So if someone's listening to us thinking, this is interesting, maybe I could do this.
Mhm.
What would the guide tell them?
Get some experience, hands-on stuff, like internships, apprenticeships at a funeral home. See what it's actually like day to day, and not just the embalming itself. It even says to volunteer at hospitals or the, what's it called, medical examiner's office to get comfortable being around.
Never thought of that, but yeah, that makes total sense.
Right. This is a big decision. You got to be sure. And if you are, it has advice on like becoming more professional. Even says to make a portfolio, show off your skills with restorative art and all that.
That's one portfolio. Yeah, pretty unique way to stand out.
For sure. It also mentions networking, like joining those funeral director groups, the associations.
Those must be helpful.
Oh, yeah. Huge help. Meeting people, keeping up with the new stuff, even have classes and all. Speaking of which, we got to talk about school. The guide mentions those mortuary science programs, right?
Yes. What are those like? Is it all, just how to embalm?
It's everything. Anatomy, how the body works, even tiny stuff, microbiology. And yeah, chemistry is a big part of it, obviously.
Well, I bet you can't just pick those embalming chemicals up at the store, right?
Nope. Got to know what you're doing, what's dangerous, how to be safe for yourself and everyone else. Safety's a big deal in the guide.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We talked about the skills, the classes, but the guide also mentions how to deal with families who are grieving.
Yeah.
That's got to be the hardest part, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it knows that. Even gives you tips on how to prepare. Like, think about times you've lost someone and how you'd answer tough questions or if they asked for something.
So you got to understand yourself first, how you deal with grief to help others.
Exactly. And there's no right answer. Everyone's different. That's why listening is so important, the guide says.
Meeting them where they're at emotionally, and you're doing this every day.
That's where the self-care stuff comes in. It talks about having people you can rely on, knowing when to ask for help. Even some of those mortuary programs, they teach you about grief counseling.
So it's not just the families or the deceased, but you got to take care of yourself too in this job.
Exactly. Can't help anyone if you're running on empty, right? The guide's big on that.
Man, this deep dive is really changing how I see this whole thing. It's not just, I don't know, it takes a lot. Knowing yourself, handling the tough stuff, being okay with like death, both the body and how it makes people feel.
I hear you. It's not for everyone, but for the
Mhm.
people who it calls to them, it can be really, I don't know, meaningful work.
The guide also had those interview questions for people wanting to be embalmers. Let's get into that. What kind of questions tell you if someone's really cut out for this?
Well, some are simple, like, why'd you want to do this? But then there's ones that make you think harder.
Like, give me an example. What would really make you go, maybe not for me?
Okay, there was one, it was like, tell me about a time you had to, like, figure out a really hard embalming case when it wasn't going right. They want to know you can handle stress, but also that you still respect the person who died and what the family wants.
Right. It's more than just knowing the steps. You got to be able to adjust and be sensitive about it.
Totally. And they had questions to see, like, where your line is ethically. One was, what if the family wants something that's against the rules for safety and all that?
Oh, wow. You'd be stuck trying to make them happy, but also you got to be professional. Crazy to think those situations happen.
Shows you it's not simple, this job. And hey, remember we talked about cremation becoming more popular? That's just one way this whole thing's changing.
Makes you wonder, what's next for embalmers? New tech, new trends, how we're going to deal with, death and all that years from now.
I know, right? It's wild to think about. We got to peek into their world, how it is now, but this guide really makes you think, how will it change?
Definitely eye-opening. We covered the technical stuff, the people skills, even how you get hired. Started as something kind of, morbid, but it's a whole profession. History, compassion, really making those last moments matter. It's pretty incredible.
It is. It is. And it reminds you, behind every death certificate, every funeral, there's a whole team making it happen. Dignity, care, the whole 9 yards.
So next time we hear embalmer, we're not going to think about, like, the stereotypes. It's art. It's respect. It's helping people through something really hard. Not just a job, like you said, more like a calling.